Well, it is good to see everyone this morning. We have a nice full building today. Now, looking at the state of our world around us, the things going on in society, many Christians have come to the conclusion that, well, we've never seen rampant evil like this before, that it's the worst it's ever been. Others have gone on and said, never has the justice system been so corrupted. Now, these conclusions have then driven many to accuse God, to say, why would God let things get so bad? And why would a loving God allow such pain and suffering? And along with this, they might ask, why doesn't God do something about all this corruption? Now, I can understand those sentiments, those concerns, and from an immediate perspective, it may be easy to try to say, well, this is the worst it's ever been. But historically speaking, these questions are not new. God's people have been asking these same questions for all of time. Why does evil seem to flourish? Why are there people who are going against God but seem to be doing well? And those are important questions that we need to know how to answer. And so we're starting in on a sermon series about the book of Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is a minor prophet, and it's not one that we study all that often. So let's talk for a moment about the context of Habakkuk. Habakkuk himself is most likely a priest. He was one of the people that was tasked with serving God at the temple, as well as teaching God's people about the law. The book was written between 612 and 606 BC. Now, if you remember the Jeremiah class that Alan taught on Wednesday nights, if you didn't go to that, look it up online and come on Wednesdays. This is just before the Babylonian captivity. This is around the same time that Jeremiah wrote. Now, in that time period, Judah and Jerusalem are steeped in idolatry and corruption. And not just a little bit of idolatry, but to the point that they were openly sacrificing their children to idols. It was horrible. And the justice system had been so corrupted that basically people were buying the outcomes that they wanted. And if you didn't have enough money, well, you weren't getting any justice. And on top of all of that, Babylon has been attacking Judah and threatening Jerusalem. So there's evil within the nation, there's evil outside the nation. And so that brings us to the actual book of Habakkuk. Today's sermon is entitled, Watch and See. In chapter 1 of Habakkuk, we're going to see something of a back and forth between the prophet and God. The prophet is going to express a complaint. Why does God allow injustice? Now God responds by saying, watch and see what I'm going to do. Habakkuk does not like God's answer, and so he asks, why would God use the wicked to punish the righteous? Now God is going to respond by saying, write down what you see. Now, to be entirely honest, this is the introduction to the book. The book is too long to do in one sermon, unless you guys want to be here all day. But chapter 1 is a little bit unsatisfying, and I get that. I want to start out by saying this is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. So come the next couple weeks to get the conclusion, the answers to the questions that Habakkuk is asking. With that being said, let's jump in and look at the prophet's question. Why does God allow injustice? Read with me, Habakkuk 1, 1 through 4. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes out perverted. Habakkuk has a very relatable complaint here. What is it that Habakkuk has observed here? Well, he's observed the Jews indulging in sin and wickedness. The people that should be God's people, that should be following God's law, And they're indulging in sin openly and blatantly. And on top of that, violence is rampant. He says, I cry out to you violence. And then in verse 2, destruction and violence are before me. And not just destruction from outside, but as we learned in the Jeremiah class, violence in between the Jews themselves. Jews attacking Jews. And along with that, strife and contentions. Now again, the Jeremiah class described this. Alan did a great job showing how this was the case, that there were factions in the Jewish nation that were actively fighting against each other. One group trying to support God's law and the prophet, another group trying to silence the prophet. This strife and contention is just rampant among God's people. And on top of it all, God's law is ignored. They're not paying attention to God's law. And justice is perverted. You know, God's people following God's law should be upholding justice, should be protecting those who are helpless. But instead, justice was perverted, and the righteous were surrounded by wicked people. Now, it's easy to read that and say, hey, the Babylonians. But as we saw in the Jeremiah class, those few Jews that were still faithful to God were surrounded on every side by, well, wicked Jews. The very people of God were practicing wickedness. Now, to be honest, we observe the same things in our culture. You know, you read through that list and he could be talking about America. Americans, we see Americans indulging in sin and wickedness. This isn't hard to see. You just step outside or turn on your TV and you see sin and wickedness rampant in your face. And violence is also rampant, not just locally, but worldwide. We have wars going on, obviously, but also violent crimes and individual violence is just absolutely rampant. We see strife and conflict. Just look at the most recent election cycle. Different groups battling against each other, calling each other evil things, speaking evil against one another, families pitted against each other because of their ideological views. Strife and conflict are rampant in our nation. And God's law is ignored, even by religious people. You know, I use that term loosely, religious people. You would like to think, in an ideal world, people who claim to follow the Bible, no matter their affiliation, should at least stand on morals, right? But God's law is ignored. People who claim the name of Christ, promoting sin in every way. And justice is perverted at all levels in our country. That's easy enough to see. You see people using their justice systems to try to control the outcome of politics. You see people who are rich that get off with things that those who are not rich would be, put in jail for. Justice is perverted at all levels. And the righteous, God's people, are surrounded by wicked people on every side. We can relate to Habakkuk's complaint here. Now I want to highlight something he says in verse 2. Look at verse 2. He says, "How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save." See, Habakkuk felt like God was not hearing his prayers. Now, there's an important word here I want to highlight. Felt. Did God hear his prayers? Well, yes. We read the rest of the book and we see God did hear his prayers. But Habakkuk felt like God wasn't hearing his prayers. This is an important fact we should always remember. Sometimes a person's feelings don't accurately reflect reality. He felt that way, but that wasn't a fact. And sometimes we may also feel like God is not hearing our prayers. We may be praying for something or about a situation, and we may pray about it for months or years or even decades. And it feels like God isn't hearing us because the result we want isn't coming about. Now again, we have to remember, sometimes our feelings don't accurately reflect reality. We do feel that way, But that may not be the fact of the matter. God is an all-knowing, all-powerful God. He knows what we're praying. The hard part is that sometimes his answer isn't what we want. And we're going to see that as he answers Habakkuk. Habakkuk's praying, but he's not necessarily going to like what God has to say. Now, at this point, emotionally, we may want or like God to give comforting reassurance. You know, like when one of my kids comes to us and having had a bad dream, and we hold them and comfort them and say it's going to be okay. We might like God to say, oh, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. It's all going to work out. But that's not what he does. Let's read God's response. God answers by saying, watch and see what I'm going to do. Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 11. He says, look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I'm doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. You see the emphasis here. God is emphatically saying, look at the nations, observe, see what's going on. Now this is really kind of interesting because there's corruption among God's people. Yet God is doing astonishing things among the sinful nations. That seems somewhat backwards to us. And in fact, he says that God is doing something so astonishing that Habakkuk would not believe it unless the information came direct from God. If some other prophet or some other person had said, hey, this is what God's going to do, Habakkuk wouldn't have believed him. So what is God going to do? He says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. Now, the Chaldeans is another name for the Babylonians. The Chaldeans would have been the regional name, you could say maybe the ethnic name, and Babylonians was their society name. They're based in the city of Babylon. It's the Babylonian Empire. So he's raising up the Chaldean people. Now, I want us to focus here on this idea that God is the one who raises up nations. God is the one who brings nations up and who brings nations down, even sinful nations. Now, there's this thought out there. It's not a true thought, but there's a thought out there that, well, Satan raises up sinful nations and God raises up righteous nations, and then they use these nations like pieces on a game board to fight, good versus evil, and we need to hope that good wins. Otherwise, something bad's going to happen. But that's not what the Bible communicates. Instead, the Bible communicates that God raises up nations, even sinful nations, and quite often he uses those sinful nations to punish other nations. And we see it, spoiler alerts, hope that you wouldn't know this was a surprise to you. God's going to use the Chaldeans to punish Israel. And then he uses the Medes and Persians to punish the Persians. And then he uses the Greeks to punish the Medes and Persians. And he uses the Romans to punish the Greeks. And it goes on and on. God raises up these nations and uses them to punish other nations. He goes on, he says, they are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour. Now there is that description of their military prowess, but I want to focus on that part that I have highlighted on the screen. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. You see, the Chaldeans didn't follow anyone else's moral compass. They felt that they were the pinnacle of human culture. And when you read about the Babylonian culture, they saw everyone else as less than they were. They felt that they had a prerogative from their gods to rule the world. Now, as a side note, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? We know some other nations that have that same opinion of themselves. He goes on and he says, all of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. You notice the description of the people themselves. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moving forward. They clip captives like sand. You see, the Chaldeans weren't fighting to defend their homes or to put down some evil. They were fighting for the love of violence and plunder. Now, we look at wars throughout history, and there's some wars that are, wars of defense, where people are defending themselves from invaders. There's other wars that are wars of ideology, where one group is trying to push their views. The Chaldeans weren't doing either of those. They just wanted power and land and stuff. So they were conquering the nations around them to be in control for the sake of the violence and the plunder. He says, then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty. They whose strength is their God. That description is so interesting. They will sweep through like the wind and pass on. You ever been in a tornado or a microburst where all of a sudden there is intense wind, trees are broken, limbs smashed down, and then it stops and it's gone? Where'd the wind go? The destruction remains, but the wind is gone. You can't see it somewhere. It's no longer there. It's just gone. That's the description God uses for the Chaldeans. See, the Chaldean Empire only lasted about 70 years. Now, that's kind of shocking when you think about it. Like, we see them so much in the Bible and we read about them, and we kind of assume that they've, lasted for hundreds of years or something. But the Chaldean Empire really started with Nebuchadnezzar. He was the one that expanded it from a city-state to an empire. And by the time of his grandson, the Medes and Persians came in and took over. Not even 3 full generations did that nation last. See, God used them as instruments of his judgment, but they were still punished for their sins. And that's important for us to remember. God used them. They were God's instrument of destruction, and they were a sinful people. But they were still punished for their sins. Now, that answer to Habakkuk's question is not the answer that Habakkuk would want. And I want us to build an analogy for a second of how we might feel if we were to pray to God and say, there's this bad situation, and he were to answer and say, well, it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that you were going to magically, whoop, and it was all going to be better, and sunshine and rainbows and daffodils. I didn't want to hear things were going to get worse. So next we see the prophet's complaint. Why would God use the wicked to punish the righteous? Habakkuk 1, verses 12 through 17. Habakkuk says, and notice his reverence here. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, have established them to correct. Now, you do notice he is very reverent towards God. He shows respect, honor towards God, even though God told him something he didn't want to hear. But Habakkuk is obviously confused by God's statements. He is not sure what to make of this. He acknowledges that God will use the Chaldeans, yet he is also sure that God will not allow the Jews to die. And it's such an interesting little phrase in the middle of that, where he inserts in there, we will not die. What's he mean by that? What's he mean by saying we will not die? Well, maybe he thinks that the majority of the Jews will survive. You know, that the Chaldeans will come in, they'll make war, the Jews will get the message, and most of them will survive. Or maybe he thinks that the nation will survive, even if many of the individuals die. It's not really clear what exactly he means by that. One way or the other, though, it's going to be worse than he thinks. Because if we remember our history, the Jeremiah class, and then other things we've studied about the Babylonian captivity, the majority of the Jews were killed. The rest were taken off into captivity or fled to Egypt. The nation was dissolved. For all intents and purposes, there was not a nation of Israel anymore. It was worse than he probably even imagines. But let's get back to the text. Verse 13, he says, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? This is such a poignant question, because he's right. God's eyes cannot look upon evil, cannot look upon wickedness, and cannot deal treacherously. Now let's talk about this for a second. What does it mean when he says God's eyes cannot look on evil? Because obviously God is an all-knowing, all-powerful God. So he knows when evil exists. This isn't meaning that God is blind to evil. What it's meaning is that God cannot look with favor upon evil. He can't approve of it. So if God's eyes cannot approve of evil and cannot approve of wickedness or deal treacherously, Habakkuk asks, if those things are true, how can God look on the Chaldeans, who are a sinful people, who are a wicked nation? How can he seem to look with approval upon them? And that's a very poignant question. That's a question that we might ask. Why do people who are corrupt get into power and stay in power? Why do people who are bent on violence get into positions where they can perpetrate violence? Why do these things happen? And then he goes on, he asks another question. Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Now, I think this right here, this question hits at the heart of the issue. Because Habakkuk, he seems to have forgotten momentarily his original complaint. Remember what his original complaint was back in verses 1 through 4, starting verse 2, he says, how long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. Remember, historically, at that point, the Jews were not more righteous than the Chaldeans. They were steeped in idolatry and wickedness. They were perverting justice. They were sacrificing their children outside the gates of the city. They were not righteous. There were righteous people in the nation, but the nation as a whole was not more righteous. See, Habakkuk has fallen into what we might call the in-group bias. This is defined, it's also known as in-group favoritism. It is the tendency for people to give preferential treatment to others who belong to the same group that they do. To approve of things that people in your clique do. Even though the Jews were sinning greatly, Habakkuk felt that they must be better than the Chaldeans simply because they were Jews. That is, God's people, the elect. And so obviously, just because the very fact that they're Jews must make them more righteous than the Chaldeans. But that wasn't the case. Now this in-group bias is really relevant to us today. Whatever group we happen to be in. You know, it's really easy to think, well, because America does it, it's right. And that we always have the high ground, because obviously I live here, so it's got to have the moral high ground, right? But that's not the case. It's easy to think that maybe our political party always has it right, because it's what I've chosen. Obviously, it's better, right? It's even easy to think that maybe those who are religious, who claim the name of Christ, are always going to be on the right side, right? Well, not necessarily. It may even be tempting to say that just because a congregation has Church of Christ on the sign, that they must be doctrinally correct. But that's not true either. We need to be really careful about this in-group bias, because it can really lead us into some untrue and unsafe conclusions. Now, Habakkuk, in verses 14 through 15, he says this, "Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together with their fishing nets. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. So he draws this analogy of people being fish of the sea that the Chaldeans are dragging up as if they're just mindless animals. He says, therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net, because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. He's making a factual statement here. Rather than worshiping the one true God, the Chaldeans worship the implements of their conquest. They don't worship God. They're not righteous in any way. And Habakkuk is confused and upset that God will allow an idolatrous people to prosper. He's frustrated here. You can see the frustration in the way he expresses himself. He goes on, he says, will they therefore empty their nets and continually slay nations without sparing? Habakkuk is also frustrated the Chaldeans seem to be getting away with their sin. They seem to be winning. They keep conquering nations and perpetuating their evil, and it seems like they're getting away with it. You know, we may have similar questions. We may see the world around us and say, why do the wicked prosper? Why do they seem to be getting away with it? Why is wickedness and evil allowed to flourish? And that set of questions, that worry, has driven many people away from Christ. Driven many people to abandon the faith, to throw their hands up and say it's worthless. And that might even be a danger for people here today. Wondering, why would God let these things happen? So what does God answer? Well, God answers and says, write what you see. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, before we get to God's answer, we have to see Habakkuk's next statement. He says, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me, and how I may reply when I'm reproved. I love the humility of Habakkuk's statement here. Habakkuk knows that he might have spoken impetuously, and he's ready to be corrected if God so chooses. He spoke his mind, but then he says, okay, I'm going to stay at my guard post, I'm going to stand on the wall, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to be ready for when God reproves me. What a great example that is to us. We have some important lessons we can learn from Habakkuk there. One, we should take our cares and concerns to God. Things that worry us, things that are on our mind, we need to take those to God. We need to lay out our hearts to God. And we should ask the hard questions that plague us. Those hard, faith-shaking questions that plague us. We need to ask those questions. Because here's what ends up happening. If we don't ask those questions, they get bottled up inside, and they start to fester like a wound. And they grow to the point that they've taken over us. And then we explode, and we say, well, there's no answers to these questions, so I'm going to leave God. Don't let them fester. Ask those questions when they're still little tiny, when the cut is still little. Address it. Ask that question. Get the answers. But we also must be willing to accept the education or correction that may come our way. You know, we ask those questions, those faith-shaking questions. We take our concerns to God and we pour out our heart to Him. And the answers that God's Word presents to us may not be the ones we want to hear. They may be hard. They may require us to change. They may be things that go against our cultural biases. But we need to be willing to accept the education or correction that may come our way. Now, God does give Habakkuk an answer. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Now he basically tells Habakkuk, write down what you're going to see. And you notice he says to inscribe it on tablets. Not on a piece of papyrus or a piece of paper, on a stone tablet, and put it in the city. It's a marker that's not going to pass away easily, because the time is coming and those who need it, who read it, need to run. See, God is going to answer Habakkuk's question with a prophecy. Now, that's next week's sermon. So you got to come back for that part. But spoiler alert, the Chaldeans will be punished for their wickedness. They will not get away with it. God will use them as his implements of punishment, but they themselves will be punished for their wickedness. Now, today, as we've been going through this sermon of watch and see, we've seen Habakkuk's first question that is very relatable. Why does God allow injustice? And we've seen that God's answer was not one he necessarily liked. He said, wait and see what I'm going to do in the nations. And then Habakkuk had a very understandable and relatable complaint back to God that why would God use the wicked to punish the righteous? And we see that God is going to answer him, telling him to write down what he sees. Now, my friends, I know that we brought up a lot of poignant questions today, and I didn't wrap them all up in a nice tight bow. We've got to come back for next week and the week after for that. But for this week, by way of application, when times get difficult, and they will get difficult, times will be hard, whether it's because of health issues or financial issues or national issues or whatever's going on. Times will get difficult. When they do, pray. Take your concerns to God. Of course, pray when things are good. Also, build that habit of prayer when things are good. But when things get difficult, pray. Take your concerns to God. And when the world is unjust, when you look at the world around you, and you see injustice, and you see corruption, and it just makes your heart ache and your anger boil. When the world is unjust, trust in God's ultimate justice. God is in control, and he will bring justice. It may not be in this world the way we want to see it, but it will certainly be in the next, on that day of judgment, when God separates the sheep from the goats. So when the world's unjust, trust in God's ultimate justice. Now today, as we're closing out our sermon time, quite possibly you've had concerns or worries, anxieties. The congregation is here for you. We want to pray for you. We want to support you through those concerns. And maybe there's some sin that has crept into your life. We as the congregation want to help you through that. We want to help you to learn what God's word says and encourage you to repent of your sin. And finally, perhaps you're with us and you're not yet a Christian. And you want to learn more about what God's word says about salvation. Maybe you're ready to put Christ on in baptism. We want to help you with that. We want to facilitate that learning. So if you have a need, whatever your need may be, please let it be known as Richard leads us in this invitation song.